Very much, Felicity. Yeah, thanks very much, Felicity. Good morning from Canberra in Australia. Felicity, can you turn my video off, please? Second. Thanks. So today I'm going to be talking about Vietnam's role in understanding social and economic change in mainland Southeast Asia from 5,000 to 3,000 Cal BP. What I'll be discussing is a project that I'm currently working on with, it's funded by the Australian Research Council. It's a discovery project entitled The Missing Millennium and the Origins of Agriculture in Southeast Asia. I'm one of 3 project chief investigators. So this research project is effectively part of a project that is led by myself, Professor Lam Thi Mei Zung from the University of Social Sciences and Humanities, Hanoi, and Professor Peter Bellwood, Emeritus Professor here at the Australian National University. I can't thank these 2 people enough for all their help and support throughout this project. I'm giving this lecture, but it's really on behalf of them and the rest of the team that work on the project, who I acknowledge at some at the end. So what are we going to cover in this project today? Well, I'm going to first of all give you a little bit of context and background to Southeast Asia, the periodization, and the issues surrounding the introduction of, or the colonization by communities and the introduction of agriculture and animal management into Southeast Asia. And we're going to take a quick look at some of the outstanding research problems. And then what I'm going to do is provide 3 case studies. These are case studies that we ourselves have undertaken over the last few years from 2015 onwards. This is Dao Ram, Tak Lak, and Ru Diep. And with these 3 case studies, I'm going to discuss a number of different issues, from trade and exchange, through chronology, through stratigraphy and settlement development. And we're going to go through quite a time period as well, as I say, from about 5,000 up to about 3,500 years ago. And at the end, I'm just going to review what I've discussed a little bit and see how we're moving a little bit closer to resolution, and some of the points where we are still a bit unsure or unclear of the sort of interactions between human populations within the period that we're actually discussing, with the 5,000 to 3,500 Cal BP. So first of all, some background, some context. We've got what's called the 2-layer hypothesis in Southeast Asia. This is now supported by craniomorphometrics, genetics, and archaeology. On the map on the bottom right-hand corner here, this is from Matsumura's publication in Scientific Reports in 2019. We've got the first 2 layers of migration across Eurasia and into island Southeast Asia and down into Australasia, and then out into Melanesia and then further. The first layer is an initial southern migration and colonization of Southeast Asia and Australasia. This possibly occurred as early as 65,000 years ago, if you want to believe some of the new dates from sites in Australia like Majambebe. And this seems to have been a southern movement. This is the red, orange, yellow indicator across the southern movement here, and that's returned by Matsumura et al. As a first layer. These are hunter-gatherer populations with some plant management, increasing plant management through time. And then we have the second layer, which is origin unknown. On the map, it's indicated by the blue arrows here. with arrival purported to be around 45,000 years ago into Siberia. Then we have southern movements down through into northern China, then into southern China, and then down into Southeast Asia. This part of the world has some of the earliest, if not the earliest pottery in the world. It's dated to around 20,000 years ago. We see a transition to cereal agriculturalism and animal domestication, initially on the Yellow River, and then moving southwards to the Yangtze. This starts around sort of 9,000 years ago. And then purported southwards movement of sedentary settlements reaching Southeast Asia by around 4,000 years ago, as indicated by the arrows, the blue arrows at the bottom here. And that you can see this dispersal, so-called dispersal pattern here. You can also see the movement out through Melanesia here. The movement was also down through into Southeast Asia, mainland Southeast Asia, island Southeast Asia. Also known as, once they moved into island Southeast Asia, as the Austronesian speaking populations that colonized all the way out through to Polynesia. So that's what we're discussing here. So that is the general idea of population movements. So in modern populations, the first colonists are sometimes still referred to as Australopapuan. I don't really like the term very much myself. And these communities are not particularly evident in mainland Southeast Asia, but they are still present in regions such as Eastern Indonesia, Philippines, and the Andaman Islands. The images in the bottom left-hand corner, just to give you some idea of what I'm talking about here, the images in the bottom left-hand corner here, the far left corner is a member of the Ati community from the Philippines, one of the indigenous groups, and on the right-hand side is members of the Ifugao community. They're both indigenous groups in the Philippines. The Ati are the earlier colonizers, and then the Ifugao are related to the later colonizers. This is just to give you some idea of what we're talking about in terms of these populations. As I say, second wave colonization dominates throughout Southeast Asia in modern populations, but there's considerable admixture. This is reflected in modern human population genetics, and also to a certain extent in the archaeological record. A good example of this is the burials from Mam Bac in northern Vietnam, where the craniometrics suggest representation of both populations at around 4,000 years ago, suggesting population integration and admixture. So this image on the right-hand side here is from Matsumura et al. 2008, and hopefully you can see the variation in craniomorphometrics here. They argued that you've got both populations here from what they consider to be the first and second layer colonizations, and they argue that you've got integration, admixture, so integration of some of the first layer communities into what is a sedentary community which has animal management and cereal agriculture. So we can see it as early as 4,000 years ago. I'll come back to Mam Bac a little bit later, because as the story develops, as I'll discuss in a minute, it actually gets more, I think it gets a little bit more interesting. So what are we talking about here in terms of material culture? Well, how does this so it's so materialized when we're actually excavating, we understand the material culture. So this is the Da Buk culture from northern Vietnam. Da Buk culture exists around sort of 9,000 to 6,000 BP. This would be considered part of layer 1. And in this period, they're hunter-gatherers. They've got cord-marked, this types of cord-marked pottery, very coarse. They have flake stone tools predominantly. Then we start to see these edge ground and finally fully ground pebble axis here in the bottom of the two images here. Note that these are pebble axes. Okay, this is important to point out in a second. Burials, there's a variety of burials. The most dominant ones are crouched and side flex burials, but also during this period, you can also get things in the Philippines such as cremations as well. We also get burials where you get a lot of things like decapitations, other types of modifications to the skeletal remains or the bodies before they're buried. And then if you contrast that with the post 4,500 BP cultures in Vietnam, so it's commonly associated with the layer 2, you start to get a diversity of ornamentation, particularly in nephrite, but also in stone and in clay as well, and in shell. There's a variety of pottery forms, huge diversity in pottery forms, and they've got these very fine incised decorations on them, on the bodies and necks. And this is called impressed and incised designs, or I&I for short, so I&I pottery. And the burials are generally supine, and they have a lot of offerings. So you get a lot of pottery, you get shell beads, you get bracelets and nephrite in northern Vietnam. These types of material that we've got up here that are from Chiang Ken. So this is a difference that we see actually in the material culture. Also within after 4,500 BP, we start to see the appearance of domesticated animals and cereal agriculture as well. We've got clear evidence of animal management at Man Bac in northern Vietnam and Xuan Loc Giang in southern Vietnam, and possibly also another site called Rak Nui. So this is the difference that we see in the material culture between these two layers of first and second colonization. Vietnam also, they have a number of different complex cultures. They've split and divided up. They're recognized across Vietnam. I've only demonstrated some of these on the map. This is not all of them by a long way, but I've illustrated those that are most in the north that are most significant to us for this discussion, but some of those in the south as well, just to demonstrate that they are apparent across the country. Those in squares are pre 4,500 Cal B. Those in circles are post 4,500 Cal BP. At the top here, you've got the Phung Nhuang, just to the northwest of Hanoi. These are all located along the Red River in the lowland alluvial plains. We will touch a little bit on Phung Nhuang. We've got the Chiang Ken group, which we will be discussing here. These are, or were at the time of their settlement, were actually on islands off the coast of Vietnam. This low-lying grey area here, just to the southeast of Hanoi here, this would have all been under the sea at the time. Ha Long also here, this is another culture. These are also located predominantly on islands, the coast. Then you've got Da Buk, which I've just discussed, Queen Van, which we will talk about here. This is pre 4,500 culture, and we've got the Bao Chau culture. So these circles indicate the sort of areas or regions that these different cultures actually cover. As I go through this discussion, you'll see that these are genuine. They have got their own, they're distinguished by chronology to a certain extent. Some of them overlap, and I'll explain that in a little bit. Variations in geographic location, as you can see here on the map. And each has its own unique types of material culture. And this is very evident in the types of pottery pottery forms and decoration that they're actually producing. And they also have, I'm pretty sure they also have differences in trade and production. So what are some of the outstanding research problems? So the question is, when did the first layer 2 colonists arrive in mainland Southeast Asia? This question for us arose when we realized that by sort of 4,000 years ago, there's an awful lot of archaeological sites, or what we could call agricultural Neolithic archaeological sites across Vietnam. And it made us wonder, well, if there's that many sites, it's unlikely that they actually arrived 4,000 years ago. It's probably considerably earlier than that. We need to go and work out when, whether, where, when, and how much earlier those earlier colonists arrived. What were the lifeways of the initial colonists? Are we actually certain that they were agriculturalists at the time? And what were the relationships between local indigenous foraging communities and the incoming agricultural populations in the region? How did social and cultural and economic relationships develop within and between the communities through time? And the Man Back actually gives us a very good clue to this, as we'll see towards the end of the discussion. So we had some major objectives. This is some of them. One of the big issues that was still very much outstanding in Vietnam is chronology. My Vietnamese colleagues have done some excellent excavation. There's some really good past research to build on. But a lot of the archaeological sites that we've been working on have not been dated at all, or have quite poor chronologies. And this is one of the things that we've actually been trying to do, is basically fill in gaps. Another issue is, what do we know about settlement development? How are people behaving on sites? Are these short visited foraging sites? Do we have any evidence that we might be seeing movements towards sedentism? And can we identify that in the archaeological record? And one approach we decided to take was geomorphological analysis. This has not been done very much in Vietnam before. And this turned out to be a really or extremely effective method of identifying the formation processes on archaeological sites. And I touched mostly on this in the Tak Lak case study, which had produced some really interesting results in this sense. And objective 3 was a zooarchaeological and paleobotanical analysis of the plant and animal remains from the archaeological settlement sites, and understanding, are they hunter-gatherers? Are they agriculturalists? Are they a mixture of the two? I'm going to touch a little bit on objective 3 here. The research is still ongoing. I'll touch on that a little bit, and discuss more objective 1 and objective 2 here, and then link that in with some of the material culture attributes that we've been actually finding on the archaeological sites, and discuss more about how people are occupying these sites and what their lifeways are. So what sites are we actually going to be talking about, and where are they? Well, we're going to be talking about Dao Ram. Dao Ram's up here. It's situated in the Hoang Tan commune in Quang Ninh province, and it's about 16 kilometers northeast of a settlement site known as Trang Ken. We'll talk more about Trang Ken in a minute, but Trang Ken and Dao Ram are all part of what's known as the Trang Ken group, as I pointed out in an earlier map. And then I'm going to discuss 2 sites that are fairly close together here. Tak Lak, which is located in Tak Lak commune in Ha Tinh province, and Ru Diep, which is situated in Tak Dai commune in Ha Tinh province, and it's about 17 kilometers southwest of Tak Lak. Ru Diep is a site that sort of overlaps with the early phases of Taklak, and 2 sites that we actually dug simultaneously when we had the opportunity to in 2015. Okay, I'm going to start with the latest site chronologically, and then we'll work back through time. So we'll start with Dalram first. Now, I'm gonna discuss Dalram and Tranken a little bit at the same time, because these 2 sites have been linked historically in the archaeological record and considered to be part of what is considered the Tranken group. Tranken itself is an archaeological site in Haiphong province. It's in the Red River Delta. It would have originally been on an island. It was studied in detail by the late Nguyen Kim Zong, who did a fantastic job of the research at Tranken, and this gave us a really solid foundation to work with our research at Dalram. It's an amazing site. It's considered a specialist nephrite ornament manufacturing workshop site, and it dates to it starts around 4000 BP, and continues past the introduction of copper alloy metallurgy after sort of 3000 BP. They found thousands and thousands of fragments of nephrite, the equipment for producing nephrite ornamentation, various different types. You can see in the image down here, we've got these longitudinal beads, parts of various types of bracelet, rings, these what are they called, a penannular rings here as well, with you get the 4-pointed rings as well. So they produce beads, rings, bracelets, penannular rings, T-shaped bracelets, etc. They clearly made them on site. We've got all the working equipment. And Nguyen Kim Zong recreated manufacturing process for rings and bracelets, which I'll come back a little bit to when we discuss Dalram in a minute. As I say, excellent piece of work. And based on the nephrite manufacturing and other material cultural traits, it was considered to be contemporaneous with other settlement sites in the region, including Dalram and Botien. So in 2018, I think it was, we had an opportunity to go and excavate some of the remains of Dalram, and Dalram's situated on Tan Island. So it's still detached from the mainland, just in Quang Ninh province. In the map in the bottom here, in the bottom corner, you can just see the square there is where we actually did our excavations. To the right of that is a huge karst limestone. Sadly, this has been almost entirely quarried away. We suspect that the majority of the archaeology was on the top of the karst limestone. The earlier excavations that took place were actually on top of the karst and in the area where we actually excavated, and they found a huge amount of archaeological materials on top of the karst. Sadly, that's all gone. So the investigations in 1997, 1998, 2005, and 2009 have reported 2 phases of occupation. Phase 2, the youngest, was associated with the Dongson and dates to around 2300, 1900 BP. So it's Metal Age. What we were interested in was the phase 1, which was reportedly associated with the Tranken and dated to around 4000, 3500 BP. The issue for us was the relationship between Dalram and Tranken was rather unclear. Previous excavations had identified the production of nephrite. The issue was that it wasn't always clear what actually belonged to the earliest phase and what actually belonged to the later phase. So a differentiation between the two was difficult. There was absolutely no chronometric dating from Tranken at all, from Dalram, sorry, at all, to demonstrate that it was contemporaneous with Tranken. And we had no unclear understanding of the nephrite manufacturing in phase 1 from Dalram. We went out, I think, the year before and had a look at the site, and we identified in one of the quarrying profiles here, we identified the archaeological record from what looked to be part of the Trang group phase of Dao and we decided that we'd come back and excavate the site, at least build a chronology, excavate a small portion of what was actually left, and collect some material culture and see what we could work out about the relationships between Dao and Changken. So what we actually ended up excavating is this, as you can see here, the profile drawing here and the photographic image, the same profile, is dump material that's been dumped off the limestone karst itself and accumulated. It's accumulated in clear horizons. There's no reworking or mixing there. And one of the important factors is there's only phase one. We've got absolutely no evidence of Dongsong there at all. And this is clear in the material culture and also clear in the dating. So we dated the entire sequence, took numerous dates. A dated sequence suggests it starts between the base of Bayesian analysis. The dates seem to suggest a start between 3,730, 3,600 cal BP, and an end date around 3.5 to 3.4 cal BP. There are dates from Changken. They're not fantastic, but they're okay. The dates are all sort of 1980s, so they've got quite large error margins, but we did manage to run some Bayesian on them. And there's good correspondence, as best as we can get, with Changken and at the early to mid 4th millennium BP. And they correlate with what we're seeing at Dao. Changken, of course, has got a longer chronology. It runs into the Metal Age. Dao doesn't appear to run into the Metal Age. There seems to be a hiatus and a break between the first and second phases at Dao. So that was really helpful because we actually managed to just excavate phase one. We didn't have to worry about any contamination or mixture with phase two, so we could get a good dating sequence and then compare that with the Changken sequence. So what did we actually find that was significant? Well, at Dao we found lots of nephrite manufacturing materials and also some of the waste products. So A, C, and G here are nephrite debitage. So A is a block here. You see these small triangular cutoffs here, and G down here. These are the circles or rings that they've cut out, a nephrite that they've cut out of the middle of the rings. And J here is a finish ring here at the bottom. So Isabella Shaw, who was a former student, did a really excellent piece of research as a project. And she came up with from the implements that we actually found and the offcuts. She came up with a really great sequence of production. So she was able to reproduce the manufacturing. So you get a block, they shape it down, and then they use these slate cutting knives, which is here, B. They cut it down to the size they want, and then they cut off the corners here. So these are the offcuts of the corners. And then they use these grinding stones to grind it into a circle. And then F is really ingenious. This follows Nguyen Kim Jung, and they're using some sort of probably manually worked turntable, and they've got these drill bits, and they drill it through, and they drill from both sides. We can tell they drilled from both sides because they're not symmetric, like in G here, the circle offcuts. And then they knock them out, and then they grind down the interior rings. H here, this is an interior grinder. They polish them up, and you get the rings. This is almost identical to the process that Nguyen Kim Jung suggested for Changken as well. So we were very happy that we've got the dates, 2, we can demonstrate that they're using the same processes for producing the nephrite rings and bracelets. In addition, we found lots of pottery and other bits of material culture. The focus on the pottery here. This is local Chancan, Blanco Chancan group pottery. It's sand tempered, and this is really characteristic for these groups. It's called the Myanmar or house roof rim. Very funny things, and these are typical for this group of sites. What we also found is this pottery, D&E here, and this is imported, and this is imported from the Fung Nuang culture. So from the pottery, we can clearly see that they're importing pottery. So they're trading upriver from, if you remember, the Chancan sites were islands off the coast, just sort of southeast of Hanoi, and the Fung Nuang are northwest of Hanoi on the alluvial plains up there. They're trading between these sites around sort of 4,000 years ago. We also find an awful lot of nephrite on the Fung Nuang sites. Fung Nuang were producing some of their own nephrite ornamentation, but there's possibility that they were also introducing nephrite from the Chancan sites as well. So what have we learned from Dao Ram and the Chancan culture? Well, we've got contemporaneity within the Chancan group. We're happy with that. Settlements are linked within the Chancan group through material traditions and nephrite production. Unlike Chancan, we've only got evidence of ring and bracelet production. I'm not going to go into the details of that here, because that's a question in itself, but it's a really interesting one, which someone could ask me a question about a little bit later. We've got evidence of trade with the Fung Nuang culture to the northeast on the Red River. Chancan culture settlements are located on islands off the coast. Could this be related to coastal trading? They seem to be specializing in nephrite production. And we see nephrite potentially produced from the Chancan sites all the way south to the Bao Chao culture and up through into the Fung Nuang culture as well. And nephrite ornaments, possibly from the Chancan culture, as I say, found as far south as down in the Bao Chao culture settlements. We don't find it any further south than that. So I'll leave Dao Ram there for a minute, and we'll come back to it a little bit later on in the final discussion, and we'll move on to Tak Lak. Now, Tak Lak is a 3-phase occupation, or supposedly a 3-phase occupation, and it is, and we'll demonstrate that in a minute. Tak Lak is currently here, and you see in the map at the bottom here, is currently 4 kilometers away from the coastline. It wasn't when it was occupied, that's for sure. The modern coastal landscape consists of relic dune formations as the sea receded. It's absolutely amazing. If you drive from Tak Lak down to the coast, you actually pass through these dune formations. They still exist in places all the way down to the modern coastline. And the modern fishing villages are also located behind the dune formations, and they've got these they've got their boat ramps and things behind the dune formations, and they actually go out through their estuaries and out into the sea to do their fishing. And we can imagine this is probably the case in the later phases of the Tak Lak, as we'll see in a minute. So Tak Lak had previously been excavated in 1963, 2002 to 2005, 2014, and 2000. And we excavated 2015. There's been plenty of useful insights from the previous excavations. They demonstrated that there was deep archaeology there. They'd identified possibly 3 phases, a Queen Van culture at the base, followed by the Tak Lak culture, and then the Bao Chao culture. But the previous dating and excavation resulted in some pretty equivocal results. They've excavated in spits rather than through stratigraphic sequence, and all the deposits actually slope. So there had been some admixture through the deposits. So we wanted to go back there and see if we could sort of work out exactly, one, how old each of these different cultures were, if they really existed, whether we could actually distinguish them, and what their distinguishing features were, and whether we could actually reconstruct the settlement patterning, formation processes, and the types of material culture, and build a good chronology for the site. They did have some dates. We do know now what they dated previously, and the dates in the past are absolutely fine now that we know where they came from, exactly where they come from, which cultures they came from. So when we excavated through the deposits, we've got a illustration at the top and a photograph at the bottom here. We found 11 macro archaeological deposits, and then within that we had 2 hiatuses as well. The later one is layer 103. You can see this light deposit here. That was almost sterile, except where the features cut through. I'll come back through here. And also we had 113, which is sort of this grayish deposit that runs across near the bottom here. These are hiatuses. This was fantastic because this actually separated the 3 phases of occupation on the site. 115 at the bottom, the yellow clay, is the natural deposits at the base. Note the large post holes and features extending from the upper sequence here. You can see there's a huge one in the middle of the profile here. There's another one over on the right hand side here, and there's another couple of post holes here towards the middle here. This is important for understanding the nature of the occupation on the site, as we'll see in a little bit. So just to quickly note here, the blue and in the Bayesian analysis here are the start dates for each phase sequence. The reds are the ends of the preceding sequence, and the greens are bone dates. So at Taklak, we were actually able to anchor what were mostly charcoal dates with bone dates. I'm sorry, I should have mentioned we did that with Dalram too, which was really handy. We took 26 radiocarbon dates through the sequence. So at the bottom we had the Queen Van phase. Then we had that first hiatus that I mentioned near the bottom. Then they had what's called Taklak. They locally called the Taklak phase. The Taklak phase we could subdivide into phases 1 and 2 based on sedimentology and activity. I'll come back to that in a moment. Then we had hiatus 2, and then we had the Bauchau phase at the top. So modeled through the Bayesian here, we've got end of start dates. If we sort of bottle that down, the Queen Van probably starts around 5,000 cal BP and ends before 4,800 cal BP. The Taklak culture starts around 4,900 cal BP and ends around 4,500. And the Bauchau starts around 4,400, 4,300. We've got no end date available for that because it's been truncated at the top. Of course, Queen Van could also start before 5,000. It's just that we've got the initial start dates here, and the earliest phases are around sort of 5,000. But what was really nice about this site is we had the 2 hiatuses. We could distinctly observe the 3 different phases. They were very neatly separated out. So that would enable us then to take a look at things like the material culture and do a really nice sedimentological sequence across the different phases and different layers. So El Grono came in, who was our geomorphologist, did the sediment micromorphology for us, removed the blocks of sediment and analyzed the blocks of sediment. And these proved to be really invaluable for understanding the depositional and post-depositional processes that were occurring on the site. And we were able to identify some of the human activity on the site at the macro scale, like in situ fireplaces and things, depositional events, etc. Here I'm going to stick with the more larger scale interpretation from the analysis of the sedimentological analysis. So if we start from the earliest, initial colonists were from the Queen Van period. The short visits to an active dune front, they were primarily collecting mangrove mollusks. Then what appears to have happened is there was a sea level rise around 2900 BP, and the site was inundated. And that was the last we see of the Queen Van. There was then intermittent visits during the early or initial taklak phase. They seem to have been sort of short foraging visits, mollusk collection, and fishing on the dunes. There seems to be small post holes and stake holes, some small structures being constructed, but these don't seem to have lasted very long. They're periodic. In the later taklak phase, we see stabilization of the landscape, and we start to see a new terrestrial signature. By this period, the sea is starting to move away. As we see, there's the coastal sea recedes back. There's a major shift to longer term occupation and a notable increase in hunting of terrestrial game. The second hiatus to the site was abandoned probably for less than 200 years. And then in the final phase, we see the Bao Chao, and they're constructing large sort of permanent structures. There's deep midden deposits, and El tells us this is much more related to sort of sedentary lifestyles. So as we could divide it up, we could look at the three cultures independently. I'm going to come back to the Queen Van in a little bit when I discuss the Queen Van and Rudiep in the next case study. But in phase 2, which is the taklak phase, the pottery is generally sort of chord marked, but there is some single line incision, like this fragment here. You can see the little lines. These are made, they're not made with indent and impressed. These are actual single line incisions here, which is really quite interesting. You get these low ring feet, H here, and then you get quarried, shaped, and ground stone adzes and shouldered adzes. Note these are nothing like the things that came previously, like in Dabut. A totally different technology in this period. These are not pebbles; these are quarried stone that have been shaped. We found no inorganic ornaments within this period. If we contrast this with period 3, we get this is the Bao Chao phase. We get phase 3 pottery, really diverse range of forms. We've got the complex incised and impressed designs of characteristic of this period. And we get high foot rings and necks. So this one here, D, is a foot ring. We get clay ling ling os of this sort. And we get all these different types of variety of stone adzes. Some of them are shouldered, some of them are not shouldered, they're quadrangular. So very different material culture in the 2 phases. So what does this actually mean? Well, we actually demonstrated that our Vietnamese colleagues were right. There is 3 distinctive sequential phases with their own material cultural attributes: the Queen Van, the taklak, and the Bao Chao. Taklak has some material culture commonly associated with the post 4500 BP, like the quarried adzes and diverse pottery, and others not so well aligned. So there's no I pottery. So these are there apparently is another site nearby that also has taklak phase. We haven't seen it yet, but these sites are rare. We're not quite sure where they came from. There's nothing quite like it in other parts of Vietnam. So that's interesting in its own right. Bao Chao dates from around 4,000, 4,300 Cal BP onwards, and it contains some of the attributes associated with that sort of periodization. You've got the I pottery, you've got the stone artifacts, you've got the ornamentation. One of the interesting facts for us is we got these 4,400, 4,300 Cal BP dates. Our Vietnamese colleagues had believed that Bao Chao was early copper alloy period, but it certainly is not. It's much earlier and dates back to some of the earliest Neolithic sort of layer 1 periods. On the sedimentology, of course, showed a really great example of coastal settlement. So early periodic visitations in the Queen Van and early Taklak. And then later on, we get sedentism and construction of more permanent settlements. So that was really nice to see that changes in site occupation. And then we've got some minor evidence of rice in the Taklak phase, but it's equivocal. We're not quite sure whether it's domestic or it's wild. It's studied by Yasminda Saron for her PhD. The vertebrate faunas are still being studied by Chantiku Kim Kui and by Isa Campos. I'm not going to talk about that now. They've got some really interesting results, but I'll leave it for them to tell those stories later on. Now, moving on to our third final case study, we're going to talk about the site of Rudiep. But to talk about Rudiep, I need to talk more about the Queen Van culture as a whole, because it's a poorly understood period in Central Vietnamese prehistory. It's considered to date, the Queen Van is considered to date from about 5,000 to 3,000 BP. And it really covers this area. You can see on the map on the left-hand side, the Taklak Rudiep, that's the area you're talking about there. The Queen Van, the majority of Queen Van sites are to the north here in Queen Lu region here of Nian province. And there's numerous sites either along the coast. You can see on the right-hand map here along the coast, which is Condat and Golak Bak and Tromsø. And then we've got Queen Van and Queen Hoa that are a bit further inland. The type site is Queen Van itself, and you'll see an image of this in a minute. The shell mounds, these are shell mound sites. They comprise almost entirely of window pane oyster, Plecuna placenta. It's incredible. You'll see images in a minute. There's considered to be three phases of development in the Queen Van. The earliest of the Queen Van are on the west of what's known as the Queen Lu Gulf. On the right-hand map image here, you can see the Queen Lu Gulf. This was supposedly an inland sea, and if I show you where my cursor runs here, it comes in here, or potentially from here out to the coast here. So the earliest sites are Queen Van and Queen Hoa, and these are situated at the base of these karst limestone, upstanding limestones here, and they would have been close to the coastline there. The next is east of the Queen Lu, that's sites like Condat and Golak Bak on the side here. They're considered to be later for various reasons that I'll touch on in a minute, but partly that they're closer to the coast, and this would have been undersea when these were first occupied. And then there's an expansion into Ha Tinh province, and this includes Taklak and Rudiep, so a southwards expansion to Taklak and Rudiep. Some of the logic behind this, I'll come to in a sec. They are hunter-gatherer shell mounds with evidence of habitation. Now, on the left-hand side here, in the bottom corner, this is Queen Van site itself. Sadly, the entire upper layers are being removed. This used to be an open market situated on the top of this. Just to our right over here, there's a road that goes up onto the top of the mound. This is now a National Heritage Site. There's still at least 2 or 3 meters. The excavations here have shown that in places it's up to 5 meters deep, but you can see myself and Professor Lamaison here talking about the Queen Van site here, and you can actually see in the background the shell mound here. They're predominantly flakestone tool artifacts found on these sites. Pottery is rare in the early sites, but generally pointed bases. So in the middle image here, these are the type of pointed bases that they recover. Their pit burials are crouched flex burials, as I pointed out early on. This is characteristic of the sort of pre-Neolithic layer 1, if you want to call them, hunter-gatherer populations. They argue pottery increases through time with more diversity and round bases. You see this to the east, so sites like Condat and Golak Nam have these round bases and more pottery than you find in Queen Van. And then you get, later on, you get evidence of cobble axes, adzes, and then possibly very late in the sequence, introduction of quarried stone adzes. I'll come to that in a minute. So we had, when we were digging at Taklak, we also had the opportunity to go to a site called Rudiup, which is about 17 kilometers away in Hartin province. And this is image of myself and Kui working at Rudiup. And on the right-hand side is one of the profiles. As you can see, this is just a compressed, packed oyster shell, nearly entirely oyster shell. We had to dig this by hand with gloves. We just broke it along the profile, and then we just lifted it by hand. It was important that we did that, and I'll show you why in a minute. It was the best way to actually excavate it. Originally, it was 7 meters deep, but the upper layers, or many of the upper layers, have been removed. They were using the shell for fertilizer and cement. You can see in the image on the left-hand side, this big hole here. That's where they've infilled part of the quarry that they've actually excavated to remove the shell. And the remaining shell mounting was in places up to 2 meters deep. So this is a profile of the Rudiup, and you can see Kui and I were stood at the bottom down here, and this is part of the disturbance on the top here. These are all the layers that we identified in that part of the in the sequence, and as you can see, it's not just straightforward piles of Placuna placenta shells. In between, sandwiched between the layers, are these other cultural layers, deposits, and from these layers we get post holes, hearths, other features. We've got burial F90. If I just drop back quickly, burial F90. If you can see where my cursor is, there it is in the profile down there. So there's actually a burial in the profile down here. There's actually burials from in the mound to under the mound as well. So burials within the mound, as I've just said. So we Bayesian modeled the last 2 meters, found that the accumulation began around 5,220 to 5,000 cal BP. It ended around 5,200 to 5,030 cal BP. As you can see, the dates, the start and end dates overlap almost entirely, and the Bayesian is almost a complete straight line. Amazing. It's estimated that the entire sequence, bottom 2 meters of sequence, all built up within about 50 years, really quite rapidly. What did we find in terms of material culture? Some quite sophisticated bone points. You've got the spear points here, and we've got the 3-prong leister. These were all found together, all still in situ. The binding was gone, unfortunately, but they were all together there. We found extended burials. So the burial we excavated here on the right hand side, as you can see, is an extended burial. It's not a crouch flex burial. We also found a fragment of quarried stone adze, not a pebble axe. This is quarried stone axe, also important. We also had the rounded base pottery. We also had evidence of construction in the living spaces on top. We had hearths as well as lots and lots of post holes in the deposits. There's potential for cultural and ideological significance with the placement of the burials in the mounds as well. I won't go into too much detail about that, but it's really interesting, particularly as you imagine some of these mounds were 7, 8, 9 meters high. I think they were built, they were constructed deliberately from these Placuna placenta flat shells. Initial mound construction was around 5,200 cal BP. We've got no end date, of course, because we've lost the top of the mound. But Taklak gives us a possible end date. Taklak being 17 kilometers away, I'd say, of around sort of 4,900 BP for this Queen Van phase. Extended supine burial rather than crouched, as I noted. And we had pointed and rounded base pottery. And as you can see, we reconstructed one of these pots that we found within one of these cultural layers on the left-hand side here. So what does the research from Queen Van tell us? Well, Queen Van is the oldest culture in our chronological sequence so far, with a purported late phase, Rudiap and Taklak, commencing around 5,200 Cal BP. Remember that our Vietnamese colleagues consider this to be the later phase. So that's, we're saying that the later phase at this stage starts around 5,200 Cal BP. Dates from Taklak indicate end date of around 4,900 Cal BP. The mounds were utilized as living spaces and for burial. So some features that clearly reflect the pre-4,500 Cal BP hunter-gatherer community, which includes most of the lithic assemblages, flake stone grinders, and coastal foraging. They're coastal foragers we know from the animal bone that we recovered from here. But we've got supine burials and quarried stone, a characteristic of later periods. So let's put all this together. What does this actually mean? If we take these three sites and the research that we've done so far, well, we understand now that the arrival of new communities and the transition from foraging to farming was considerably more complex than we previously envisaged. We're starting to build a better chronology. So we're getting good chronological frameworks now, and this is really assisting us in developing a better understanding of the timing and duration of these various cultures. So we now know that we've got the Queen Van, the Taklak, the Bao Chao, the Phung Nung, and the Phung Nung, and the Chang Ken overlap with each other. They overlap with the Bao Chao. They've got the I and I pottery. We see the certainly in the later phases of Bao Chao, not Bao Chao at Taklak. We don't have any nephrite there. It's too early, I think. We see the production of these materials. We suspect that basically what we're seeing from the early phases, so the Queen Van, as we saw, we see these supine burials, and we see stone adzes emerging, sort of quarried stone adzes. This might be contact up and down the coasts and transmission of ideas and material culture. So I suspect that the Queen Van are still hunter-gatherer population, but they're already in contact with these populations that are moving from the north southwards. This isn't to say that they've already colonized by 5,200 BP, but it's not much. It's just a little bit later. They certainly appear to have by, say, around 5,000 BP, and certainly by 4,800. We can see that with the Taklak culture. So coastal settlements likely established, as I say, around sort of 4,800, 5,000 BP. Now, the question at the moment is, are these coastal foragers or are they agriculturalists? This is a question that we'll answer very soon, I hope, certainly. By 4,000 Cal BP, there's a large number of established settlements all across Vietnam and all across Southeast Asia, just focused on Vietnam here. We've got the Trang Ken group, we've got the Ha Long group, we've got the Phung Nung group, we've got the Bao Chao group in the north. Well, the north and south, we see An Xuan. We've got the sites along the Dong Nai River, like Miluk and Sui Lin and Khao Lao Rua. And we're starting to see cultural and social diversification. So we see this in Trang Ken. They've got their own, they manufacture their own pottery designs. They specialize in nephrite production. Phung Nung, they're down on the alluvial terraces there. They appear to be cereal agriculturalists. They've got their own pottery designs as well. And we see integration, like, for example, at Man Bac. Now, if we place Man Bac into this new chronology, we see that the two, let's say, the two populations, say forager and agricultural populations, they're, let's say, integrated here, perhaps almost 1,000 years after initial colonization by these migrants from the north. That's interesting to demonstrate, you know, that this was an ongoing process for over a long period of time. So, as I say, by 4,000 BP, we've got craft specialization already apparent, and trading networks have been well established. This is reflected in the nephrite manufacturing Changkeng group, and it's also reflected in the stone quarrying down in the south along the Dong Nai River, and tool production is also evident. So by 4,000 years ago, this isn't the earliest phases of colonization from the north, perhaps. They're already well established. They've established, communities are established, settlements are established, and they've diversified if they hadn't even diversified before they moved into Southeast Asia, and they're then trading with each other, but they have their own identities. I will leave it there. I've done my hour.